Welcome to Just Info for All. This is a panel specifically about the Just Info project, but in talking about this one project, we're going to address a little bit more broadly about the concept of information and lack of information for people involved in the criminal system in New York, and also wider than that. Briefly, my name is Meg Maurus. I'm the moderator chair of this panel. And I just really briefly want to start maybe on this side and have everyone introduce themselves, since I don't have your bios right in front of me.
Sure. My name is Nathan Sheard. Also work with Just Info, as well as the Black Movement Law Project, and organize with Mutant Legal, which is a legal activist collective in New York.
Hi, I'm Abigal Robinson. I'm an organizer with Just Info and also with Mutant Legal, and during the day get paid to be a paralegal at the law office of Rankin and Taylor.
I'm Moira Meltzer-Cohen. I'm an attorney in private practice. I do criminal defense, and I work with incarcerated persons. I'm a founding member of Just Info, and I also organize with Abigail and Nathan with Mutant Legal, and I do legal observing and pro bono protester defense with the National Lawyers Guild.
Meg Maurus. I'm the project manager for the Just Info hotline.
All right. It's wonderful to see you all here today. So I just want to dive right in with, this panel is essentially about the concept of the right to information. So the broad sense of just the actual right to information and what it means to be a right. And so we're going to talk more broadly about that, but it's kind of specifically about this one intervention trying to address that broader issue of information. So I want to start by talking specifically about this project, and to the extent that we don't address some of the broader, more theoretical issues of the right to information and the lack thereof and what that means, we'll kind of talk more about it towards the end, I think. Sound good? Okay, so to whomever wants to start, just explain exactly what this project is.
Okay, well, what we do on the daily is we have a phone number, a toll-free phone number set up that people can call with their questions about the legal system. We don't give legal advice, which would be information that's persuasive or responsive to questions about a specific case. Those would be questions that would need to be answered by an attorney, and specifically the attorney representing whoever that caller was. We give legal information. So we give information about the courts. We give information about people's constitutional rights. We answer questions like, how do I find out if I have a warrant, or how do I clear a warrant? How do I pay fines for a criminal court? How do I put money on someone's books at Rikers? We answer questions like, my kid just got arrested at this intersection, what precinct would they have been taken to? We store a huge amount of information in a database, in a wiki-structured database that is accessible to our hotline operators, so that depending on the nature of the question, whoever is answering the phone doesn't need to be a lawyer and doesn't need to be an expert necessarily in the court system. They can look up the answer and find it. We give answers to questions that many people have, and all of these bits of information that we give out are supposed to be public, but they're very, very difficult to find, particularly if you're in crisis, and particularly if you don't already know what you're looking for. So those are the kinds of questions we answer. The other thing we do is that we give service referrals to callers to address the underlying determinants of involvement with the criminal penal system, because as we know, a lot of policing involves arrests for identity rather than arrests for conduct. So we try to hook people up with resources and services that are in their neighborhood, or that address various other kinds of issues they have that might be leading to their involvement with the penal system. So some of those things are like problems with housing or mental health issues. The final thing that JustInfo does is that we, if callers are interested, we want to make sure that people do understand that they have a voice, and that all of the information that we're giving out is public, that they can have ownership of it, and that they can take action, that they're not alone in being without information or suffering at the hands of the legal system. So we try to help interested callers hook up either with JustInfo itself or with other community-based organizations that are in their neighborhoods that agitate against aggressive policing and mass incarceration, just to kind of boost civic engagement and let people really feel that they are not alone and that they have some power.
Excellent. Does anybody, and the answer might be me, maybe, but I feel like I always end up answering this one, but do either of you two or Mo or Eric want to address kind of where this project came from? Like, what was its origination? And I think there's multiple perspectives on this, which is part of why I opened it up to everybody.
I mean, to some extent, I think it came out of work that a number of us had been doing specifically with activists, and seeing the profound impact that our work had on enabling activists to engage in their own defense and be connected to the wealth of resources that exist throughout the city that are there to support folks in their involvement who end up with some level of involvement in the criminal system, but also recognizing that a lot of that information wasn't being made accessible to folks who were being most targeted by the police, and trying to figure out how could we reduce that barrier to access that information.
Yeah, do you have anything to add? I feel like you were a prime mover actually in developing this project.
I mean, I think one of the things, and I'd actually maybe open this back up, taking kind of what you said. I mean, my specific involvement came from representing people in court, specifically from Occupy, and I think other folks in here came at it from jail support, and I think one of the things that I want to talk about in this panel is how we move beyond that origin story, because I think what it came about, all of us were spending, you know, for me it was a job with the National Lawyers Guild, a paid position. For many others it was not, but it was through the idea of, you know, how do we track people who have been arrested as part of a protest, or, you know, related activities, you know, like just on the peripheries of that, tracking every single person who was arrested from, you know, and all the little crevices that one can get lost in that before they get down to get arraigned. And then after someone's arraigned, things like, where's my property, or my property got destroyed, what do I do? I forgot my court date, I don't know who my lawyer is, I don't like my lawyer, you know, I forgot to do my community service, I forgot to go to court, like all of the questions people have, and kind of looking at one another and saying, well, what on earth does everyone else do? This is just this, you know, over 2,000 people were arrested during that kind of prime phase one, let's say, of Occupy, which was, you know, September of 2011 to, let's say, March, April, May of 2012, fair to say? I mean, you know, different panel, but, you know, so let's say 2,000 to 3,000 people were arrested. Well, you know, tens of thousands of people actually are detained, arrested, and so, you know, JustInfo kind of came about from people looking at each other saying, you know, we've institutionalized all this knowledge, we've written all this down, we've done so much of this, how can we not lose this knowledge? And to the extent that there are the need, which it appeared to be, you know, so often we would be down in court and someone would have been sitting there for, you know, 10 hours waiting for someone to be arraigned, and you just wanted to say, well, you know what, like, you need the arrest number, and you didn't need to be here right now. Like, I know you're scared, I know you need something to do, I know you're worried and concerned, and the best thing in the world is to be here for somebody, but at the same time, you're here 8 hours too early, which is no fun for anyone who's ever sat in court. So how do we go about making all this information accessible? And I'm going to ask some of you guys questions, but I think all of us came at it from a different perspective and at different places in time. And one of the things that I want to talk about later maybe is how that history in a way is a burden, or burden might not be the right word, but how do we move beyond that origin and kind of fulfill, I think, what we all want to be. But also, let's just talk about maybe the mechanics a little bit of how have we systematized that information, how's it working, utilizing volunteers, things like that. And maybe specifically the wiki. Anybody?
We spent a lot of time, actually mostly Meg, spent a lot of time collating a lot of information that we all just had in our heads that, and also information from, various associations of attorneys and legal workers and activists regarding things like, at the most basic level, the operating hours of the courts or the phone numbers for different offices in the courts. And at more complex levels, things like know your rights trainings for different groups of at-risk people. So we have in our wiki, written out longhand, we have know your rights trainings for everyone from protesters to sex workers to non-citizens. We have information about what to do and what your rights are during a car stop, or if you get called by the FBI on the telephone. But we also have a lot of information like that we gathered from websites, such as what is the process for putting money into somebody's commissary account if they are in a state prison? What are the visiting regulations and resources for taking a trip upstate to visit someone at a prison? Things like that, right? So a very broad range of information, as I said, ranging from the very mundane, like what is the phone number to the court clerk's office at the Brooklyn Criminal Court, to much more complicated questions like what are the rights of school children. And that was all gathered. It's all in an online database that we do hope someday to make at least parts of it public, because all of the information in it is public. The issue at this point, I guess the barrier that we have encountered is that although we've gathered together all this information and can really be a clearinghouse, the maintenance in making sure that all that information is updated and accurate is really important. And I think we have a little bit of anxiety about putting out information that may in any way be misleading. So we have an enormous amount of resources, referrals, facts, phone numbers, and it's all linked in this. It's all hyperlinked and cross-linked in this wiki structure, which I know has been a trial and a triumph.
Yeah, and one thing I think people don't necessarily, when we say it's a wiki, it really just looks like a wiki page.
Like a Wikipedia.
Yeah, Wikipedia, basically. And there's all kinds of forms, and it's ended up being a platform. An intern that we had one summer solved our, he's probably gonna mess everything up. Solved our forum, or what's the word, platform problem? Medium problem. Something you said.
If I can,
Yeah.
I think Mo kind of touched on it, but just to kind of underscore that, like, all of it's information. It's like none of it is information that we created, right? It's all information that's readily available. That is available to folks, but it's a matter of like knowing where to look for it, right? And like where can you find this information, and sometimes even knowing what is it that you're looking for, right? So that's also a part of it. Like the people who are answering the phone need to be trained in like hearing what the person is conveying and trying to figure out like what are the pieces of information that this person needs to be able to address the things they're looking for, and having one place to be able to go for that rather than having to look over like several different pages, several different websites from umpteen different city agencies or non-government agencies, and just making that information really accessible. That so a lot of the work is finding out where are the places that this information already exists, and putting it into one easily accessible place, and then training folks on how to extrapolate what is the important information that needs to be conveyed to the caller.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, when you look at callers and they're looking for specific information, some of it is, if you know what you're looking for and you know where it's at, it's easy to find. For example, we got a caller who was asking about executive clemency. And this is a caller who probably went on the Department of Correctional Services website. And the department has all of its directives on its website. But the way it's indexed and cataloged, it's hard to find executive clemency, and all of the rules and regulations and protocols around executive clemency is right there. But I wanted to also talk about when I first came on to Just Info, I thought we have to create some buzz because we're talking about information not being accessible, and there's also this problem of people not knowing that this resource exists. So really trying to create buzz and letting people know that there's this resource that can connect you to information that you need. So we find that, one, we talk about this information is public and it's accessible, but then people don't even know that entities such as Just Info exist in order to tap into that to get this information. So we're really looking to get the word out there. And another thing in terms of, we talk about service referrals, and we want the service referrals to be bona fide. And we're looking for this to be interactive. If a Just Info operator gives someone a referral, please get back to us and let us know how that worked out. And if it didn't work out, or if you had any problems with that, we need to know this so we can, vet this particular resource and maybe not use it, but find out more about it. So we look and we talk about empowering people mostly affected by mass incarceration and the criminal legal system, but we look for a degree of reciprocity. We are looking to work with people for them to take ownership of this information to get better outcomes. I want to later talk about how critical information, correct information could be in making a big difference when someone enters the criminal justice system. And the story that I'm going to tell is the difference between, 8 years and 4 months and 20 years. And, unfortunately, it's a matter of doing time, but if someone had to choose between doing 8 years, 4 months as opposed to 20 years before being eligible for parole, just by having a little information, and that could have made the difference between serving 8 years, 4 months, and 20 years.
And that actually is one of the next questions, which is kind of if maybe a couple people can give concrete examples of the difference between knowing the answer and not the answer. And one thing I kind of want to add into this conversation is that we've talked a lot about amongst, I think, the group and this project is the underlying idea of, the goal being that community members help other community members, and that there's a level of care and concern and also empathy and understanding having been through the process that might not exist otherwise. So the one example I'll kind of throw out, and then I want some other people to give examples as well, because they're varied, and I think that's something that will come to light through everyone, people who want to give examples, giving examples, but getting your property back after getting arrested has been a thing that's come up a lot. In that it's all a big bureaucracy. So people who get arrested on a regular basis kind of know, some people who are targeted a lot might know, like, well, my property's going to be at the precinct, but your property follows you. So then it goes to Rikers, and then it might go to 1PP, and you don't totally know. And a lot of times your ID gets taken with your property. And this was an issue that we were dealing with earlier this year with a community organization that we work with, where they had had a number of people get arrested and released and not be able to get their property because they don't have their ID, because their ID is in their property. So you're supposed to go, when you're arrested, you're supposed to go through, if you're going to go through to arraignment, you get your ID and anything under $100. So you're supposed to be allowed to keep with you in cash. But all too often your wallet gets taken, or your wallet's in your bag or whatever, or the only ID you have is your benefits card, and that's in your pocket in your backpack, which is vouchered. So you get released. The most perhaps easy. So the first issue is, where is my stuff? The second issue is how do I get the Metro cards to go get my stuff? The third issue is how do I let them know? If it's at Rikers, I have to call 311. 311 makes an appointment. Usually the appointment's in 4 or 5 days. So what do I do from between now and 4 or 5 days when I need to go get a shelter? I need to figure out how to get food. I need to, this, that, and the other. So this is an issue which is bigger than just info, right? But it might be a place where we can do advocacy, and that's something that we're talking about. But it's also a thing where if you go up to a court officer, the court officer is going to be like, yeah, you have to call 311. And then you call 311, and then you're like, well, wait, now I have to figure out how to get there. And so then the issue becomes, how do I get there? And then you go talk to someone else, and they give you some little snippet of information. And what happens is, like anything else, I think systems that capture poor people, right? Which is that you go to this office, and they're like, oh yeah, no, this is the right office, but you need this, this, and this before you can do that. And so then you go to the next office where you're trying to get this, this, and this. Well, you went to the wrong one first because you need that before you can do this, before you can do the first thing. And that is often how information is packaged and disseminated. And the idea being, well, you can go ahead and run all over. So you might get the little piece of information. Well, you have to get to court early to clear a warrant. But then when you go to Brooklyn court early, they, oh no, this is a summons actually of being Manhattan. And so one thing that we try and do is all that information is together, and the idea is kind of the issue spot. Like, what really are you asking? Because the thing that you start with, the thing that a caller might lead with, the thing that is bothering them most, might not be the most key piece of information you need to figure out what they need or what they're trying to get. And so one of the things that we do is we put a lot of emphasis on like crisis, talking to people who are upset and really empathizing and trying to understand the problem, and then giving them a full and complete answer and encouraging people to call back. And I think that's one of the things that we don't necessarily always think about it, but that's something that I think makes this project unique in terms of just the basic, before we even get into some of the bigger, broader issues of information. But on that note, like anything I just said, but also just any examples you can think of just to make more concrete.
Can I just add one thing?
Absolutely.
In my previous experience with the hotline, I saw the same thing. It was a question, but it was really something else they actually wanted, but
Yep.
it began with that.
Yep.
And when you had really skilled operators, they would get that information out of them and always encourage them to call back.
Yep.
And we would have people call back and say, I spoke to Nathan last time, is he available again? And it seems like the operators develop relationships with callers, and callers will call back, and sometimes they expect that same operator. But I did find that in my previous experience with the hotline, there's the question, but there's all of these things underlying the question, and this is what I really need.
Right. I do want to respond to another thing that you said, right, which is, I mentioned earlier that we have this wiki that's full of public information that we would like to make public. But it occurred to me as you were talking, Meg, that one of the reasons that I think we've been reticent to do that at this point is we have this intervention that is actually more than just providing information. It's organizing information, it's listening to the whole problem, right, and greeting the whole person and trying to hear from them the way that they are defining the problem. And based on that information that we get from the caller, we have a whole complex of things, and we're going to end up giving them a whole constellation of information. So it's not just, the caller's question, the way that they are asking the question may not actually be the significant thing. And second of all, a lot of the time when someone calls, they don't know what their question is. They don't even know how to ask a question. They say, here is the thing that happened. What do I do? How do I find my child? How do I find my property? Right, but that question is coming out in the midst of a story. So I think there is also this concern, right, because, and it's important to recognize this, we're providing information, but it actually isn't just information. It's also a sort of a triage service and a problem-solving service where there is this human intervention that is actually a really key component. And if we were simply to put the wiki out there, it might not actually be entirely useful because you would just end up reverting back to that kind of Byzantine bureaucratic information in dribs and drabs kind of structure, which would just be overwhelming again. So, yeah.
And I think one of the things we talked about as a kind of a fundamental principle, and then we'll kind of go back to just kind of go off what something you said is, you know, the question becomes who has access to online too.
Right.
The idea being, you know, just sometimes it's just really important to be able to pick up a phone and ask a question that doesn't involve you researching, it doesn't involve you Googling. And I do think a lot is lost in translation because so often you can write down a thing, and I mean, you know, for any of us who do legal work in any capacity, all too often it's like, it depends. You know, when you look up someone and you're like, man, it's been 25 hours, I don't know where this person is, where are they? It isn't as simple as going online and saying, well, where are they? Because the answer is, well, if this, then that, and if that, then that, and it might just be this, and it could be that, and, you know, did the person get hurt? Does the person take medication? All of those things kind of come into play, which aren't going to be resolved, but more fundamentally, the idea being, yes, all this information is available, but taken as these scattered information, bits and pieces here and there, one, who has that time, and two, it doesn't necessarily create a whole answer.
Right.
So, you know, there was a real huge importance placed on in the very beginning. I think originally the idea being was that it was going to be easy. Like, well, this is just going to be so easy because we're going to take all this stuff and it's already there, and we'll just put it all together, and then all of this is just going to be so easy. And it turned out to be really not easy to put all that information together. But the end result being, let's make this easy for the person calling, and then let's enable that person to somehow connect, hopefully. You know, with every answer, the goal is to say, you know what, too, like, if you felt like you were unjustly stopped, like, yes, let's give you a referral to CCRB or to a civil attorney, but there's also organizations around you that do this work, and if you're so inclined, here's the next thing. And we haven't, I think that's maybe a thing we hasn't totally come to fruition, but it's certainly a goal. But going back to the idea of information, I know Eric, you'd said you had an example. Others might also have examples they wanted to share of like what happens when, you know, the difference between having a piece of information and not having it.
Right. This happened quite some time ago, and I think the major problem was you had a couple of teenagers, they were arrested, and they were arrested for felony murder, and no weapon was involved. They beat someone up, and 30 days later, the individual died from a generalized infection in the hospital. So they charged 6 of them, I believe. One had made a confession, so he had a separate trial, and then 5 were tried together, and 3 actually weren't there, but the other guys were their friends, and they would have been there if they were with their friends that day. So none of them really believed that they were responsible for murder. I mean, it was felony murder, and they could not grasp felony murder. And so here you had a group of teenagers, I think between 16 and 18, the oldest. And one, they had this great mistrust of the system. So part of, I think, our job is, you know, when you become a credible messenger of information, the people think and believe, I can call them and they'll tell me the truth. So there's, I guess, the hermeneutics of suspicion, even when you don't know that, of the system and everybody who works for the system. So even when you're given information, they say, I don't believe it, because they're trying to trick me or trap me. So I think it's really important as we move forward that the word is out there. If you want correct information, this is the place to call. So anyways, these young men were looking for information, and to a certain extent they got it, but they didn't believe it. They didn't believe that the crime that they had committed was felony murder. And you know, even in reading the statute, and you know, their parents were totally flabbergasted because they didn't see what had happened as murder, as people normally envision murder, because there's this felony murder rule definition of murder. You know, the 6 of you attempted to rob somebody, and during the course of that felony, you beat him up, and 30 days later he died. I mean, one of the attorneys, the person who had implicated himself, who had a separate trial, his attorney at least did bring that up, that, hey, you know, the victim may not have actually died from the wounds inflicted, but from this generalized infection while he was in the hospital for those 30 days. So one, you had these parents looking for the information. Two, you had these young people, they were getting some information, but they didn't believe it because they couldn't even believe and understand that what they were being charged with was the truth. I mean, I think we talk about people involved in the criminal justice system, that there's some knowledge, but there's also a lot of mythology and urban legends, and so it's hard to figure out what's true and what's not true and what's a half-truth. So I think that these individuals with the correct information from a credible messenger that they believed in, like I know that I can call this place because there's no vested interest here, and they'll give me the information that I need, and then it's on me to make a decision based on that. And they all probably could have been convicted of lesser offenses, but they went to trial thinking nobody's going to define us guilty of murder. The five who went to trial together were all given 25 years to life. The one whose case was separated from the five because he implicated himself was given 15 years to life. And his attorney seemed to have done a better job in putting out there in the universe that, you know, really, the person probably did not die because of the wounds inflicted. And the judge took that into consideration in sentencing this individual to the minimum under the law as opposed to the maximum under the law. And ironically, the judge who presided over the five, I think the crime happened in 83. They were sentenced in 85. So Como was governor then, first Como. And the sentencing judge said, they're lucky we have a governor who is opposed to the death penalty because I could just as well be sentencing them to death as opposed to 25 years to life. So I think if something like Just Info existed and, you know, the message got through to them, look, if you go to trial, the way it's structured, you know, it may not look like murder, but this legal definition of murder says it's murder. And then to do everything in your power, if you have to, you know, at least assert the affirmative defense or plead guilty to the lesser included offense, which would have been a difference, even if they got the maximum sentence of 8 1/3 to 25, as opposed to 25 years to life, which they got. And they, 83, they all did 25 years, and the other one did 15.
Yeah, I think the important thing right there is giving people the information that they need to make informed decisions, right? So had they been able to get information from a trusted source, then they would have been empowered to make decisions that could have had a profound effect on.
And they would have been in a better position to make that informed decision as opposed to, you know, they just out to get me, you know.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I didn't even hit this guy, but I was with them. And
I think the trusted source piece is, I think, the next level of where we're at in Just Info, and also how we connect to our origin story of, you know, the NLG is a trusted source for the activist community. So activists knew they could call the NLG and get reliable information. And what we really want for Just Info, and this is, I think, for us, the next hurdle, the next thing, we figure out how to get our volunteer base to also be our callers, and our volunteers should be the same people. So when people call, they're speaking to someone that can relate to them, or ideally people they know in their community, and so that this information is being given out by people who understand what the callers are going.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there's one piece of this that should be lifted up a little bit, just as far as, I'm not going to give a single concrete example of this because they're just too numerous, but one of the prevailing things that we find is this isn't simply about not having access to information. I think, as Meg said, the difference between having an answer and not having an answer. It's that the difference between not having an answer and having an answer is not only a big difference, but the difference and the stakes are different depending on who you are. So if you are a white college-educated kid who got arrested during a protest and then forgot all about your court date, moved to San Francisco, and you come back several years later and you go to get your warrant cleared, or you don't know that you have a warrant, and you know, the stakes there are fairly low because you are not a person who is going to be targeted for arrest. If you are a young black or brown man between the ages of 14 and 24, and you get arrested and you are targeted frequently for arrest or for summonsing, and you miss a court date, and you don't know that you have a warrant, or you don't know how to clear the warrant, the next time you get targeted for a stop and frisk, whether or not you are guilty of any wrongdoing, that warrant is going to show up and you will get put all the way through the system. So it's not simply what is the impact on my life of not having an answer. The question is also who is asking the question. And I think for us, one of the really important things about JustInfo, and the reason that it came up at all, was we could see very clearly, it was just very stark, that the largely white, largely college-educated people who were engaged in what they at least believed was First Amendment protected activity during Occupy Wall Street, who were often putting themselves in the way of law enforcement with full consent, and you know, they were very aware that this was what was happening, that they were risking arrest, and were doing so intentionally, had access to all this information. And even when they didn't, the stakes for them, the consequences for them were fairly low. But that is not, you know, but we were also spending a lot of time in court, and we were seeing that they were the vast minority of arrests. That most of the people who were going in and out of those criminal courtrooms were people who were trying desperately not to get arrested, and people for whom the consequences of an arrest or conviction were very serious. Not just a conviction, but loss of student loans, loss of benefits, loss of public housing. These were life-changing, permanent consequences for many groups of people who are explicitly targeted on the basis of the way the NYPD perceives their identity. So, you know, again, it's not just a matter of having or not having the information. It's a matter of what those consequences really look like for different groups, and they're different.
Yeah. And I also think it's a level. It's also the access piece also includes financial access, right? Because if I'm concerned that I may have a warrant, the last people I want to call is any city agency, right? As opposed to if you're a person of means, right, then you can call a private attorney up and ask them all the questions that you want to ask them, and then get the questions in a low risk engagement, right? But that doesn't exist for folks who don't have who don't. A lot of times there's not access to a public defender unless you're already being charged, or like you're at the arraignment process, or you know, post that. So there's a different level of access to information based on what financial means that you have, right? And so that's another thing that JustInfo is able to address, and also taking into account that there's also the internet divide, right? That different people have different levels of access to technology, and then again going back to what we said before, that it's also a matter of, even if you have access to that technology, if you don't know what are the questions that you need to be asking, that's a larger problem, right?
The magical language, the legal system is filled with magical language if you don't know the key thing. Like something as simple as knowing the difference between an arrest number and a docket number, and just the key phrases that you have to say when you're communicating with city agencies of what it is you're looking for and how they store and label the information.
And even just to add insult to injury, if you already are lacking that information, right, the magic language, there's a certain kind of social punishment that happens, right? If you are in a court building and you're trying to find a loved one who has been arrested, and you don't say the right words, you know, you're already in a very stressful situation. And I've seen court clerks and court officers condescend to, or scream at, or actually remove from courtrooms people who have simple questions that could be easily answered, but are in one way or another using, you know, what that official is perceiving as incorrect language, and then that person gets punished for it. I mean, I think we maybe had a client once whose mom got arrested at the precinct because she was looking for her. It was a colleague's client got arrested at a precinct because she went to look for her son, and the police didn't like the way that she asked whether her son was present. So I think even just that, having a safe space to ask those questions and determine what the question is can be really important.
I want to just kind of take it a little more broadly, to the extent that, so this is one project, and if people have there are other, I guess more, let's just talk a little bit more broadly about the right to information as a whole. Are there, and one of the things we were talking about in preparation for this is, the risks involved, it seems like a very benign concept, that people should have a right to the information that affects them when it comes to systems of power that regulate or attempt to regulate their lives and the way in which they live them. So, but when we talk about providing that information, I mean, examples or thoughts on, it sounds really easy and it sounds really self-evident. But, if anyone has any thoughts about barriers to that kind of exist beyond just people don't have the information, why, and some of the underlying factors there.
I mean, I think the complexity of the way any bureaucracy works, but specifically criminal injustice systems, and particularly here in New York City that is so large, is making the information complicated, making it so you have to have all this knowledge. I mean, I myself as a legal professional sometimes still go to a new court and don't know the magic language and am spoken to terribly, even coming from a position of privilege. So I think that keeping these systems complicated, and you have to know the keywords, like that's, to me, another level, another way the system is oppressive. And it relies on people, whether it was designed intentionally or not, you're not going to just know this information. Like, why would you ever know this information? We don't teach it in school. So I think, the work JustInfo is doing and the other groups do is a way to help people feel empowered to push back as much as they can against an oppressive system.
And I would add to that, that's sort of what we see on an individual level, or like that's the impact that filters down. But I think we actually have to think very carefully about whether there are risks involved in providing information to criminal defendants, and if so, what are they? I think one of the things we realized early on was I think to some extent I had assumed that there was a project already like JustInfo, and I think I may have even thought it was operated through the court system. And criminal defendants are people who have been arrested. They are not people who have been convicted, right? But because they're criminal defendants, they are not a population that has endeared themselves to, for example, the legislature. So there is no funding. There are hotlines, right, that legal aid operates that are for housing or civil issues. There are hotlines, for example, for people who are involved in family courts due to domestic violence. There is no such hotline or court navigator system for criminal defendants. And that, okay, we see that funding and the sort of sympathetic nature or lack of sympathy that's given to criminal defendants. I feel like that's a discourse that we're familiar with. But I think we need to be aware of the fact that there are groups increasingly whose very existence is not just criminalized in the way that we see black and brown men being targeted for arrest, but literally unlawful, right? So if you look at, there was a court case called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, where some groups, I think the Center for Constitutional Rights was one, and the Humanitarian Law Project, were trying to do something very much like JustInfo. They were trying to give information about international law and I think nonviolent communication and mediation to groups like the PKK that were they were designated foreign terrorist organizations. The State Department had said these groups, their very existence is unlawful, and providing information to these groups constitutes terrorism. constitutes material support for terrorism. So, you know, on the one hand, we aren't there, right? Poor black and brown men in New York City are not outlawed. But we need to be aware that there are situations in which there have been instances of providing information, the simple act of providing information that is frankly public, right? International law is not secret stuff. It's complicated, but it isn't secret. So there are precedents of doing what we are doing constituting a crime, and not just any crime, but constituting the worst possible crime. And that isn't a coincidence, right? Because when you push back against the power of the state, when you push back against the monopoly of state violence, which is in this instance perpetuated and maintained in large part by these small little pieces like access to information, that is part of the way down the road toward making yourself an enemy of the state, right? And I don't think, I think that, I hear myself saying this and I feel like I sound like a total fringe lunatic, but I think it's important to just keep in the back of our minds that this has happened before, that the act of providing information to people who are unwanted or who are in some way a threat to the power of the state has itself become a crime.
Sure. It looks less so when you look at how often lack of information is used as a tool against members of black and brown communities throughout New York. Like, look at all the folks who have been arrested for drug possession charges because they were ordered to empty their pockets, right? And they didn't, and had they had the information that they did not need to do that, right? And they would not have had any charges against them, right? When you look at how many folks, because they didn't know that they needed to like actively say, I choose to remain silent, right? They did remain silent, but their body motions and other things were used against them, right? The fact that you don't have to be read your rights unless you're in a very specific situation, right? There's all of these different ways that lack of access to information is used as a tool. Yes. Right, and so when you start providing things that lessen that tool, then yeah, you do. I mean, you run into it, and and realistically, I don't think it's a problem. I don't think it's something that we're going to face, right?
I think maybe a more.
But go on for a second.
I want to highlight the work of the community cop watch groups in New York City and beyond. I mean, I think they're doing a really great job of doing a thing that's really legal and also providing information, like very individual information on individual situations, but I think they're definitely facing a little bit of a backlash now, and individual people that are just filming police on their own are getting arrested, and that's completely legal. But I think that's really important work, and I think that doing that is a good way to hold systems, and particularly police, accountable.
And that's important, right, to remember that what we're doing is actually not in conflict with the Constitution of the United States, right? And I think that providing information when that is seen as a threat, when those systems of barriers and those gates, those gatekeeping mechanisms are used as a sword, a weapon in the hands of law enforcement, and then providing the stated goals of the state, right, the promises of the state, is not actually supposed to be in conflict with what law enforcement is doing. So I think that's really important to recognize, because what we're doing is not supposed to be any kind of criminal, but it certainly is something that, as mentioned, hasn't been funded by the courts or the legislatures. So.
Well, one thing I think most fundamentally kind of perhaps summarizing, perhaps not, but information is by its very essence a source of power. So if you have information and it gives you already 2 steps up, because if you don't have the information, you can't use the information. So one example you were giving is, if you don't know that you don't have to tell somebody something, if you don't know it's not illegal anymore, even though it's still on the books, but it's not, it's decriminalized to have syringes as an example. People still get arrested for it. But people know I shouldn't be getting arrested for this. I should, you know, you can't ask me this, you can't ask me my gender, you can't do this, you can't do that. Or you can do this, or you have to do this. Even access to health care while you're in that process in between arrest and arraignment. Those sorts, that is a source of, there's a reason why rights to information or access to information is often repressed, and it's because having information gives you a sense, gives you empowerment. So to say like, hey look, you don't know this, but right down the street is this organization working on this, and 15, 20 people are suddenly down there going, oh hey, let's organize as a community. Well, you know, it's like the first domino in the eyes of some. I mean, it's not a domino, it's a brick on the way to something awesome. But I mean, for those in power, it can be very, very scary, this very simple act, which is, you know, I think maybe the umbrella, or, you know, the bottom, one or the other, or both maybe, holding up kind of this very small sliver that we're aiming to do, which, you know, which gets us to our, kind of our last main topic, which is, you know, do you guys consider Just Info, you know, sort of an act of resistance or an act of, you know, an act of solidarity? You know, how do you place it? All of you guys do activist work, you know, how does Just Info fit within it? It's not exactly, you know, a political campaign or a, you know, where do you locate it within how do you think about it, this work?
Prison walls are probably about to crumble, probably within the next
Yeah.
next couple minutes, I'm guessing.
Like the walls of Jericho? I'm not sure about that. I mean, if providing information is an act of resistance, then yes, and it shouldn't be. I mean, we talk about this information being public. It's just not as accessible as it should be, and people don't know what they don't know, and that's the main problem, I think, that there's this body of knowledge, and we talk about being in this information age, and then there's, specifically around the criminal legal system, like half-truths about it, misunderstandings about it, and the lack of knowledge about it. And, you know, the court system says ignorance of the law is no excuse. You're going to be held fully accountable. So it's really important that people know what they need to know when encountering the criminal legal system specifically.
I mean, I think that there are trans folks who are probably being manipulated right now because they had condoms on them, right? There are young youth in Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens who are being manipulated right now because they had marijuana that somehow got exposed on them, right? There are so many instances right now where folks are using folks' lacks of information about their rights as power to manipulate them and to have many and to create dire effects on their entire communities, right? And so I think that it's definitely political, and the fact that, like, if you look at political as affecting that power, right, and that power and that manipulation, so it's yeah. So I mean, yes.
Yeah.
I think the right to legal information, like the right to a fair trial and stuff, like this is rhetoric that's so often, you know, like the equal justice system. I don't know how you can have equality without having the basic knowledge of how things work. Like, this is the discourse, the rhetoric that is always held up as like what this nation is built on and held up as American values. And I think we know that's not the reality, or we now know. Some of us, like myself, may have used to think that was the reality, and it's very much not. So I think our project, in theory, lines up with this false rhetoric of, oh yeah, we're just helping send this information that's already public. But we know the reality, the examples Nash gave, the other examples given, like, is the reality of where we're at. And so I think that and as pointed out, knowledge is inherently power. And so by providing people knowledge, I hope that our project helps empower people to be able to resist state oppression even just a little bit at a time each day.
Yeah, I think we are in this ironic position of holding the state accountable to the promises that it has already made. And I think that's like an interesting position for us to be in, for
With the
many
hope
of us.
that the result is not what they
What
say.
they, right, that it actually turns out better than that.
Yeah.
But I think that we do have this sort of, our sort of most lofty aspirations do involve actually, first of all, knowing that we are not alone. Abigail mentioned Cop Watch. There are many other organizations, Malcolm X Grassroots, Communities United for Police Reform, CCR. There are many, many organizations and student groups and bar association groups, LGBT Center, and community groups, like smaller ones, affinity groups, who are sort of getting hip to this, and not just in New York, right? But globally and across the nation, right? What we see happening, you know, in Baltimore and Ferguson, Detroit, Cleveland, these kinds of groups that do popular legal education are springing up all over the place. There used to be a very big one in San Francisco called the Midnight Special Law Collective. There's a group in Chicago called First Defense Chicago, which is an organization of criminal defense attorneys that does a very similar thing to Just Info, with the added component that they actually do provide representation for the callers. But I think there is starting to really be a sense that this is not a New York problem. This is not a problem that's limited to big cities. This is not a problem that only happens in rural places. It is endemic to the entire legal system, this lack of information. And the lack of information always falls hardest on the most marginalized, and access to the information always has the biggest impact on the most marginalized, right? And so I think our hope is that if we can truly bring down those barriers and have that like viral spread of information where the police are truly on the street level always held accountable, and where the, you know, what we see coming through our arraignment courts, you know, what the prosecutors are seeing, you know, that the prosecutors are being held accountable and that the judges are then being held accountable. If people are actually system-wide, all the way up and down, able to assert their rights at every level, that it may cause some kind of culture shift. And that's obviously, as I said, a very lofty goal, but I think it's, you know, why bother if we're not going to dream big, right?
And I think something just to anchor that too is, I think there's a growing awareness throughout the entire country of the sheer prevalence that the criminal system has on, you know, all lives, but particularly some lives. So in the sense that there's a growing sense and awareness of that, you know, for many people, you do not walk through the day without encountering some policing. You don't know, you know, most families don't have most families are not untouched by incarceration, by the effects of incarceration, dislocation of family, all of those sorts of things that go along with being the world's largest imprisoner, you know, this country. So, you know, this is a thing that many people need, and the more educated we are about it, and I think something that goes along with that is that, you know, we do have a limit, which is that even the best information doesn't change the fact that the system is unjust, right? So, I mean, for example, you know, there's, in New York, this is particular to New York State, but it's something that sprang to mind while you were talking, which is that it becomes a felony, burglary, if you're shoplifting from a store you've already shoplifted from. So it's called trespass notice burglary. It becomes a burglary. So, and that is the law. It's a bad law. It means that people go to prison. Not so long ago, I had a client who went to prison for 1.5 to 3 years for stealing 2 T-shirts from Macy's. So that is information I can provide, and I always do. I say to people, listen, you're gonna be convicted right now of petty larceny. That's a misdemeanor. Don't ever go back to that or any other of that type of store. So if you can go into a store in upstate New York, you know, but if it's still a Duane Reade and they figure out that you signed a trespass notice in this Duane Reade, it becomes a burglary, which becomes a felony, which means you're a predicate felon. For some people, it has consequences. That guy, actually, I got him an offer, and it still was 1.5 to 3 years. And so there's a person right now, upstate in New York State prison, who's in prison because he was in a drug program, and he got kicked out of the drug program because he got back late, and he didn't have a shirt, and he went and got a shirt, and, you know, basically choices, little choices one makes. And so no amount of information, I mean, in a sense, and I bring this up because I've thought about it in the context of this project, which is that on one hand, information could have helped him, right? He could have stolen a t-shirt from somewhere else and it would have been a misdemeanor. On the other hand, no amount of information makes that law, for him, makes that law just. Like, I can scream and yell and or be as articulate as I can in a courtroom, but what happened to him was perfectly legal. I represented him as best I could, and what happened was the best outcome that the system as it exists could have provided for him, and it was an absolutely horrific and like Jean Valjean moment, really. But what it can do, perhaps, is through those examples and through perhaps, and this is not yet part of our project, but part of our project could very well be eventually, and who knows, but I mean, there's a flip side to that information. Those people who are privileged and are not part of this system, like most people are not going to say, yeah, that's great, that guy should go to prison for that long, that guy should go to prison at all, for that, and most people don't know that law exists. So that information, again, that's another kind of a flip side, which we don't do, but something to bring up.
And that's why we give service referrals also,
Yep.
right? And
Yeah.
that's why we try to hook people up with our, it's harm reduction, right? It doesn't,
Yeah.
and that's what we can do. But, right? I knew it, I knew the prison walls were about to fall. I could feel it. But I think that, in all seriousness, one of the reasons that we do give those service referrals, that we do give civil rights attorney referrals, and that we do try to connect people with civic organizations, community-based organizations that organize around these issues, is that we understand that the information in and of itself is not sufficient to change the systems. While those systems are standing, which apparently they are no longer, but while the prisons continue to exist, while cops continue to police identity rather than conduct, while cops continue to exist, we might say, there are people who are suffering at the hands of those systems, and so we need some kind of intervention until the glorious day when we live in a utopia and we are all self-regulating and self-determining.
And we should give out more info on jury nullification.
Oh,
Yeah.
we should. That's a good idea.
Does anyone else have anything to add, or time to hit the cafe? No? All right, well.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
I was just wondering for those of you who started in Occupy or other activist things, like what was the transition like from servicing people who were activists, choosing to get arrested, or maybe not choosing, but in that scene, to people who are not activists and know nothing about the law or like their situations, what's going on in their situation?
Well, I'll start. I mean, for me, I find a lot of times, well, it wasn't too difficult because I think we all had lives before and then we all had lives after. So for me anyway, it wasn't difficult so much. I mean, I found actually that, and one of the things I found with the hotline maybe in particular is that people who are over-policed have more information than you'd imagine. It's more about the runaround and some of the holes in that information. So I mean, for example, I mean the arrest process. So for activists who are arrested, it seemed to be like this kind of, oh no, what happens now? Like I have no idea what happens now. I'm like here and and like, and with when you encounter people whose family members have been arrested, usually they know the part where they go down to court and they get an arrest number. And then they go sit in court and they'll go and ask court officers. It's about making that process a little more transparent because they know that's what they need to do, but they don't necessarily know that they don't need to do it as quickly as they do. And they don't necessarily know exactly who to talk to and how to make that a more not empowered, but rather like you see people come in and they're kind of holding this little piece of paper that has an arrest number, and they know they need this number, but they don't totally know why. And I think it keeps it very detached or far from them in terms of them being able to walk in and be like, my son, my cousin, whomever, my sister, whomever got arrested, here's the arrest number, they are not yet docketed, I know what that means, and I'm asking you, the court officer, to put the little stamp on the piece of paper that lets legal aid know that family's in the courtroom, because you have a stamp and you can just stamp it. And sometimes it's how you approach someone, because if you approach someone like that, you know, you're gonna get a different response. The response is gonna be, you know what you're talking about, and I'm gonna go do that. And so I find that a lot of times, whereas with activists, you're kind of sitting there and, you know, I think some of it's, with activists, there's a different education that sometimes has to happen. Like the amount of times I go back there and be like, well, the last thing I want is a public defender, you know, and it's like, well, I was a public defender. So, you know, you're getting a public defender, and, you know, kind of doing some education around that. And so in a way, it's more about, I've been surprised, not surprised, like shocked at the realization of it, but I just didn't think about it ahead of time, that the types of information and how that information needs to be conveyed is different. But I think that the underlying need for information is kind of the same, but the way in which it's played out is a little bit different. And yeah, and I think too, just something to add, the last thing I'll add is that, you know, during Occupy, I found, especially during the occupation of Zuccotti, this kind of ceased after the eviction from Zuccotti, but the people that would get arrested, at least a handful on a daily basis, there was like somewhere between like 7 and 15 arrests, just kind of on your average day in Zuccotti, sans an action of, you know, however you define that. And then there'd be like big action days kind of thing. So like N17 was a big action day where, you know, everyone's arrested for standing in the street, for whatever reason. And but the people arrested, yeah, the people arrested on those day-to-day, like 5 to 10 people, tended to be the most marginalized of the people you'd imagine being at Zuccotti. So it was a homeless guy, it was the kind of crazy guy, it was the black guy, it was the people that you would, if you took a whole smattering of random people and put them in a place, and you just kind of figure what policing looks like on any average day, that tended to be it. So on those kind of day-to-day periods, you know, so one of the criticisms you'd hear during Occupy was, well, you guys have mobilized this giant force to take care of these activists who are trying to get arrested. And, you know, I think that there's a whole conversation to be had about that, you know, and I didn't agree with that entirely. But one of the things that was lost was that the people who were targeted were the people who you'd expect to be targeted. So, you know, there was examples, for example, there was 3 or 4 times at least where people who were Palestinian solidarity activists, or people who were Muslim, or people who had changed their name, or people who were homeless, were the ones who were targeted and questioned in a different way, in a different place, by the Joint Terrorism Task Force was there once just because a guy had traveled and was Pakistani. And I mean that, so in the sense of that, it was the exact same thing as anything else with the added layer of it all. But I mean, that's kind of a, you know, I don't want to overstate that, but it was definitely present in a way I think people don't totally realize, because it's always stated as like the white privileged college educated activists who were down at Occupy, and that kind of erases a whole thing. I mean, it is not completely incorrect in many circumstances, but it's also completely kind of erasing a really huge thing that happened alongside all of that. So, and when you imagine who got targeted out of that, you can guess.
It's predictable.
Yeah.
I think to me, there was a process of education with the people who were intentionally putting themselves in harm's way during those actions at Occupy. There was a funny process of education that involved people starting out, standing in the street screaming about how they didn't trust the police and they didn't trust the justice system, and then getting arrested and being very indignant. were so indignant that the police would lie to them. And I was like, were you not just standing out in public on camera with a sign about how the police are not to be trusted? So there was a process of education where, despite their rhetoric, sometimes these young people, and actually older people also, would be, their entitlement showed,
Yeah.
right? Because they had no personal experience. They believed in abstract terms that the criminal court system was corrupt, but it was inconceivable to them that a police officer would lie personally to them. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
no, it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was definitely like, I think in a good way for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah,
it
I
was
think
just
it was
really
great.
kind of like a college of activism, like, metaphorically anyway,
Yeah.
where people with certain thoughts had to have those challenged.
Yes.
And I saw people engage in that process in this really beautiful way. And I saw people engage in that process in a really not so beautiful way. But for a lot of people, yeah, you come into it with certain, this is my beliefs and this is this, and I joined this thing, and again, I'm regressing to this stereotype, but I took this class in college, and I'm a feminist, and then they're obnoxious through an entire meeting, right? So I mean, there was this training process that was really accelerated because of the sheer intensity of it all. And with some arrests, yeah, you're talking to someone, and I'm like, yeah, you're
Yeah.
protesting for this thing, and then but when it all happened to you, it was a thing you couldn't actually talk about. You couldn't actually internalize. And I think too, there's a process. This happened. I can't remember exactly the whole thing, but when I was in this Southwest down in Arizona doing work with migrants and people being deported, or hopefully not, but there was this whole intro session, and the person kind of was like, "This is geared toward all of you who have never actually encountered this. That there's just kind of this rage that's kind of impotent. Like, you don't think you can fix everything. Like, you can't actually fix anything, or everything, rather. And you also have to give people self-determination. Like, if they say to you, I want this, you can't be like, no, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to call the governor. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I can call this person who was a college professor I had, and they're going to fix it. And they're going to fix it for you because this isn't okay, and I can't watch this thing that isn't okay." And I think that comes from never having to be in a situation where there isn't a good outcome. There isn't a thing that's going to feel good at the end, and you can't always win. And that kind of exists in a different way. I mean, I think that when you're talking about providing information for people, for some people there's this, I don't want to call it resignation, but kind of an acceptance of, I get beat on a lot. And then with activists, a lot of times you have kind of the opposite problem. There's this sort of they can't do the impotent rage thing, where I'm feeling overwhelmingly wronged. And since I've never been wronged before, I've just read about it. I can't actually process this at all, and what comes out is often very ugly.
Yeah.
Not someone's best moment. And so I find, and it's not, I want to make sure to not act like it's two categories and they're
Yeah.
always that way. But I found having to kind of negotiate those two really extreme emotional responses, which are very valid, but tend to manifest themselves differently, I think.
And I do think, I want to sort of clarify too that you do get that kind of indignant response from other people as well, from non-activists. And I think that what you said about it being a sort of an activist college is important, right? Because a lot of those protesters who were their first arrest were so indignant, we then were able to have conversations about mass incarceration and targeted policing, and about the fact that, you feel like you are being targeted because you are an activist, and that may very well be true. And are you also aware that this is the kind of targeting to which many people throughout this city are and have been subject for a very long time? And I think it made a lot of difference for a lot of people to hear that and to start to really understand that they were not just you are not alone in this sort of comforting you are not alone way, but to understand that they were not special.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that was actually a moment of humility for a lot of people, and it was really important. That said, I got a call on the Just Info hotline recently from someone who was having a very difficult time understanding that the fact that something was unjust did not make it unlawful.
Right.
right? And so I think,
Yep.
you know, I guess I wouldn't as much posit there being a difference between activists and non-activists as I would posit there being a difference between people who have and have not ever had any experience of the legal system that they felt as being unjust, and also understanding that it was nevertheless lawful.
At the same time, I just want to say, because like as I'm hearing, as I'm listening to both of you, I like all of these different conversations that I've had with like folks who are from like well-known targeted communities, right, and folks who've gotten arrested because they're activists, right,
Mm-hmm.
and the way those conversations, I know like there's not that they're always different, but the way like predominantly like this conversation is like this and this conversation is like that, and listening to folks who are having like, their first like intentional arrest and being like, I can't believe that they did this thing. And like my first response is, okay, that's silly, right? Because like that's just the way that looks. But then like happened, but now like as I'm thinking about it through, the other thing that goes in my head is like, well wait, actually that is still like bad that happens, right? Like so like and then in my mind I'm like, yeah, well that's just what happens. But like we should be like, well we should also be like talking about like that's not okay either. Like it's not just because it's not as horrific as the other thing, right? It's like, yeah, like actually wait a second, that's actually kind of messed up too, you know?
I think that's totally true, like in the sense of, when you talk about, especially about people who do legal work of any type, there is this sense of, well, yeah, no kidding, that happens.
Yeah.
That you really have to always fight against. And particularly when you're trying to make legal decisions in a case, and speaking for me, you know, it's like, oh, why bother filing that? You'll always lose, or why bother looking, you know, I mean, I don't, but you have that sense of like, well, I'm sure that search will be fine, but you still have to fight each time because it isn't actually okay that happened, even if it is legal.
Right.
And finding ways to intervene and try and make that not legal has to be part of the way in which one practices. But also, I think there did come to be that thing. I think it still very much exists where it's like, well, you're an activist, and so therefore, like, I have clients where this happened to me, you know. And I think ranking that is a thing to really try and avoid. But also having activists. I mean, not always, and especially if they were in big groups, they would tend to be just together the whole time, which was good for them. But one thing I found a few times was when you spend the night in jail or however long in jail, and you're there sitting next to someone who's like, man, I missed work, I finally got a job, I missed work, I got arrested for, you know, jumping a turnstile. And the consequences of that, and meeting someone where you're like, oh man, like you really, because there's this weird little bonding thing that happens if you're in a holding cell with people generally, where it's like even if you never, it's like any other situation where it's like you never knew each other and this semi-unexpected thing happened, very unexpected thing depending, and now you're suddenly together and it's like you suddenly care about that person a lot in this way that, so-and-so fell asleep on the subway, and so that's illegal, and so of course they're arrested. And those things, when you emerge kind of on the other end, for many people, it was a very profound thing. To be when you're leaving them, and someone comes to get you, and so you get arraigned quicker because you have a private lawyer, and you know you're released because why wouldn't you be released? And then you're out there, and someone's hugging you and giving you some snacks, and you're thinking, what about those 10 people back there? You know, they are going to be okay, but you're leaving them. And I think for some people it's a very important process.
And sometimes they're not going to be okay.
And
sometimes they're going to be deported. Sometimes they're going to go to Rikers because they can't make $250 or $750 bail.
And I think it's been said, and I want to highlight, I think a good way that they experience, some people got very self-righteous about like their own individual thing that happened to them, and you're right that like it's still not okay that happened, but I think a lot more of myself being someone who was involved in jail support during Occupy and got arrested during Occupy, and I think a lot of us took those experiences, as Emma was saying, and are now, instead of focusing on like the one little thing that happened to us, are now using that as experience to help people or to work with people in communities where this happens to all of the time, now that we have a little bit of a better understanding. And I think that's what the heart of the Just Info project.
Yeah, the activists were a point of entry, but I think we in some ways went through the same And I think we went through the same process, right? Like, we were serving this one community, and just as they started making these connections to mass incarceration, so did we.